Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Today, we're going to continue the album anniversary series to kickstart 2025, taking a look at my top 20 favorite rock and metal releases of 1995, turning 30 this year. So, with that in mind, let's get started. Number 20, I'm going to go with Balance by Van Halen, the final Van Halen record with Sammy Hagar on lead vocals, and probably the one Van Hagar record that gets the least amount of attention, but I think Sammy goes out really strong here, the band took a more serious approach to the album's songwriting, compared to the previous releases with Sammy Hagar. But Eddie Van Halen is really the MVP of this album, in my opinion. He rules this record with some awesome riffs that I think are the album's true highlight. Also, on top of that, you have Alex Van Halen on the drums. His drumming sounds incredible in the mix, produced by Bruce Fairbairn. And some standouts for me on this record include Can't Stop Loving You, The Seventh Seal is great as well. Don't Tell Me What Love Can't Do, Amsterdam. So there's some really solid tracks on here, and I think if you took out some of the instrumentals and you added in Crossing Over instead, you'd have an all-timer of a Van Halen record. So with that in mind, I know this album is a little bit, overhated by some Van Halen fans, not necessarily put towards the top of people's lists, but I dig it. Gonna go with Balance at number 20. Number 19, gonna go with Ozzmosis by Ozzy Osbourne. I've had a love-hate relationship with this album. It's definitely not top-shelf Ozzy, in my opinion, and I think as his big comeback record, following the pseudo-retirement after No More Tears, it falls a little flat in that respect, but there are still some really strong tracks on here, some standouts that I enjoy, like Perry Mason, I Just Want You, Ghost Behind My Eyes, See You on the Other Side as well, which I believe was co-written by Lemmy, Old LA Tonight, My Jekyll Doesn't Hide. There's some fun tracks on here. It's a good record. I love the lineup here of Ozzy working with Zakk Wylde and Geezer Butler once again. And Ozzy's solo band at this point had more members of the original Black Sabbath lineup than the actual Black Sabbath did at that time. And, this is a very modern sounding record, I think, for the time that it was made. Very commercial sounding as well. Maybe, in the past I've been a bit too harsh on it. It is still an enjoyable listen. And truth is, it has its moments for sure. And it beats the life out of what Sabbath were doing in 1995 with the original Forbidden mix. So, number 19, let's go with Ozzmosis. Number 18, I'm going to go with Battles in the North by Immortal. Just ignore the terrible album cover, which I wish I had it to show you guys, but if you're familiar with the cover, well, it's very Spinal Tap-ish. Look it up. But, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge an album by its cover either. Battles in the North is one of those genre-defining black metal records, and one of the first albums I showed to someone who was new to the subgenre. This record is more of what you'd expect from Immortal, with, really picking where they left off, with, extreme tempos, low-fidelity production, and lyrics about coldness or wintry landscapes, and so it's perfect for this time of year, when it's cold and disgusting outside. This is also the final Immortal album to feature Abbat on drums, and the band would recruit Hellhammer for the video Grim and Frostbitten Kingdoms and for the subsequent tour as well. Number 17, let's go with The X Factor by Iron Maiden. Of course, if you follow the channel, you probably know by now Iron Maiden are my favorite band of all time, and so, I'd love to put this album a lot higher up on the list, but the Blaze Bayley stuff is just not top-shelf Iron Maiden. The X Factor and Virtual 11 are solid albums, but, Blaze Bayley and his job with Maiden as the lead vocalist was kind of doomed from the start. He had the impossible task of trying to replace Bruce Dickinson, and although he gives it 100% on this record, again, it's just not top-shelf material as far as I'm concerned, but The X Factor is a decent enough album for reasons I'll get into, but this is the band's first release with Blaze. It's the follow-up to Fear of the Dark, seeing Maiden getting more progressive in their sound with longer, more drawn-out tracks, and, a bit of a counter to the back-to-the-roots approach that Maiden had taken on the final two studio albums with Bruce. Also, this record definitely has a much darker tone and atmosphere, and a lot of that being attributed to Steve Harris going through a divorce at the time, and that being reflected in his songwriting. I mean, you can definitely hear that on a song like, The Unbeliever or 2 AM. And this can make for a challenging listen at times. It's a lengthy record. Again, the songs are longer and drawn out, and it's a pretty downtrodden sounding album. But, The X Factor is not without its great moments, moments that keep me coming back to it now and then. Of course, there's the classic Sign of the Cross, the live staple, during the Iron Maiden era, Man on the Edge as well. But, this album is also packed with some really underrated deep cuts that I enjoy. Songs like Lord of the Flies, Fortunes of War, Look for the Truth, Blood on the World's Hands is phenomenal. I wish they'd bring that song back in some capacity. I'd love to hear that live with Bruce now, but there are some really strong underrated tracks on here, and I think time has been friendlier to the Blaze era, now that Bruce has been back in the band for over 20 years, and at the time, this was a bit of a hard sell to the longtime Iron Maiden fan base who wanted to hear the classic lineup, and for the most part, this album, though, has aged pretty well as far as I'm concerned, and still a bit questionable as to why Iron Maiden went the route of, choosing Blaze Bayley of Wolfsbane, especially when Michael Kiske was, right there. but, to Blaze's credit, he did exactly what he was asked to. He sang his heart out on those 2 records, and, the X Factor and Virtual 11, decent albums. I feel like Blaze, during his tenure, wasn't always given a fair shake by Maiden fans or the band, who refused to slow things down live when playing, some of the classic stuff to better accommodate Blaze's voice, but nonetheless, Blaze does a fine job here. I don't think he's necessarily the problem on this record. Maiden made some questionable decisions around this period, but still, some decent tracks prevailed on the X Factor, and so I wanted to include it, but didn't really want to put it much higher on the list. Coming in at number 17, let's go with the X Factor by Iron Maiden. Number 16, Demanufacture by Fear Factory. It's their best record by far, a really cool concept album inspired by the Terminator movies, and the drumming on this record is just unreal by Raymond Herrera. It sounds like he's using a drum machine, right? But what he's really doing is just recording with a click track, and so Herrera's drumming is rapid fire on this record, and it sounds like a machine gun going off, and it really adds a lot to the album, I think. And on top of that, you have the awesome vocals by Burton C. Bell, and epic hooks on tracks like Replica, Zero Signal, and the title track, as well as many more on this record. Again, top to bottom, stacked album. Keyboards and synths were also used to give this album a harsher, industrialized sound, and Demanufacture is industrial, it grooves as well, and oddly enough, was recorded in the same studio as Bon Jovi's These Days. And funny story, at one point things were actually so loud on the other side that the guys from Bon Jovi's camp came over and said, hey, you gotta turn it down because it's bleeding into Bon Jovi's drum mics, which is actually pretty funny. But number 16, gotta go with Demanufacture by Fear Factory. Number 15, THRAK. That's fun to say, by King Crimson. This is King Crimson continuing their exploration into industrial, and it was the group's first full-length studio album since 3 of a Perfect Pair 11 years earlier, and their only full album to feature the double trio lineup of Robert Fripp, Adrian Belew, Tony Levin, Trey Gunn, Bill Bruford, and Pat Mastelotto. And it's the group's final studio album to feature either Bruford or Levin, but it's a very charismatic and chaotic sounding record. One of my personal favorites in the King Crimson catalog, just a personal preference of mine. I love Dinosaur, Vroom, Walking on Air, and People, great songs there. And one thing that really stands out to me about THRAK is that King Crimson were one of the rare cases of one of the progressive rock pioneers of the late 60s that were still making relevant music 30 years later that could compete with what the new prog juggernauts of the new era were doing. And so for that, I think THRAK is extremely strong. Number 14, Imaginations from the Other Side by Blind Guardian. The follow-up to Somewhere Far Beyond from 1992. Blind Guardian continued to add more to their sound, straying from, purely speed metal, and you have some really interesting and catchy chord progressions on this record, and an undeniable influence of European folk. Some standouts for me include I'm Alive, And the Story Ends, Born in a Morning Hall, Bright Eyes, and the 2 power ballad-esque tracks on here, A Past and Future Secret and Mordred's Song. And of course, you still have those speed metal tendencies on this record here with its rapid-fire guitar riffs and high-pitched, distorted vocals by Hansi Kirch. This would be the last album in the Blind Guardian catalog to feature Hansi Kirch on bass, and the first in which Kai Hansen did not contribute guest vocals or guitar, but to be fair, he was pretty busy this year himself with Land of the Free by Gamma Ray. But Imaginations from the Other Side is one of the best in the Blind Guardian catalog for sure. Definitely a little darker than their previous work up to this point as well, coming in at number 14. We're going to dive into some really underrated territory here at number 13 with Still Not Black Enough by WASP. A criminally overlooked WASP album here, and an album that wasn't even supposed to be released under the WASP name, but rather initially intended to be a Blackie Lawless solo project. But not many people even knew about this record when it came out, and by the time 1995 came around, WASP wasn't getting a ton of media buzz, to say the least, and record stores weren't exactly stocking their shelves with Still Not Black Enough, which is very unfortunate because this is a great album and a true hidden gem in the band's catalog. Blackie Lawless, is such a great songwriter, and this record continues with a lot of the same lyrical themes as its predecessor, The Crimson Idol, which happens to be my favorite album of all time. So many killer deep cuts and songs that have never been played live by WASP before. Some great songs on here, like the title track, Black Forever, Goodbye America, Keep Holding On, Rock and Roll to Death, Breathe, I Can't, No Way Out of Here. Every song on here is great, and I really enjoy it, even though, it never gets any attention from WASP, never gets any play. It's out of print, and it's been out of print for many years, so it's a hard album to find even now. Hands down, the most overlooked metal album of 1995, which, was more of the same for WASP. They were kind of used to that at that point. They could really never get out of the shadow of Animal or the hair metal imagery of the 80s, despite Blackie Lawless doing some phenomenal and mature work on albums like The Headless Children and The Crimson Idol, and this album right here, Still Not Black Enough, etc. So, unfortunately, this album flew under the radar, but I love it. One of my personal favorites in the WASP catalog. The more I listen to it, the more I really enjoy it and wish it got the attention it deserves. So I wanted to put it close enough to the top 10 here. Coming in at number 13, gotta go, It's Still Not Black Enough. Time for some extreme metal here with Dissection and Storm of the Light's Bane, an album I think was really ahead of its time by Dissection on their second studio effort. It's a landmark album for extreme metal, but, it's hard to brand it to one subgenre because it's super melodic in addition to its black metal and death metal vibes. So that's kind of a big deal because it was one of the first albums to combine black metal and melodeath together at the same time, leaving a huge mark on the development of, the extreme metal movement going forward. And so this is an aggressive, angry record, but also has a lot of great melodies and hooks to it, and it's an epic listen for sure, and like I said, highly influential. So number 12, gotta go with Storm of the Light's Bane by Dissection. Number 11, I'm gonna go with NOLA, the debut album by Down, an excellent supergroup consisting of vocalist Phil Anselmo of Pantera, drummer Jimmy Bower, guitarist Pepper Keenan of Corrosion of Conformity, and Kirk Weinstein of Crowbar, bassist Todd Strange also of Crowbar here. So it's a killer lineup, and NOLA is one of the best debuts of the 90s for sure. A masterclass here by a who's who of, sludge and stoner metal of the 90s, and Phil Anselmo's vocal delivery fits perfectly out the vibe and the atmosphere of this record. It all just melds really well into a swampy, doomy sounding album, and, it's one of those records that does a great job of showcasing the talents of everyone involved, with standouts here like Lifer, Pillars of Eternity, Rehab, Hail the Leaf, Underneath Everything, Bury Me in Smoke, Stone the Crow, Eyes of the South, Jail. Just so many killer songs on here. I really dig it quite a bit. I know a lot of people do as well. Coming in at number 11 here, let's go with NOLA by Down. Getting us started in the top 10 here, I'm going to go with Self-Titled by the Foo Fighters. After the death of Kurt Cobain in 1994, Dave Grohl received offers to drum for several bands, including Danzig and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I did not know that about Danzig. That actually would have been a really cool timeline, but instead, we have Dave Grohl deciding to launch his own project, the Foo Fighters here. The self-titled debut was recorded within a week in Seattle, with Grohl playing every instrument on the album and co-producing it with Barrett Jones. The end result was one of the greatest reinventions in rock history, with a classic debut album featuring tracks like I'll Stick Around, Big Me, For All the Cows, This Is a Call, and more. It's one of rock's strongest debuts and a post-grunge essential, infusing elements of punk and alternative, and Grohl would have been a major player for any band that he decided to join, following the end of Nirvana. Case in point, his drumming is probably the biggest distinguishing factor in the change of sound for Nirvana between Bleach and Nevermind. But, we knew he was extremely talented, but, starting the Foo Fighters and playing all the instruments on the debut really showcased his range in an all-new way, and so I think the instrumentation on here and the effort that Dave Grohl puts into it is phenomenal stuff. Really a solo album in its essence, considering he plays every instrument on here, but the Foo Fighters, of course, would become, a formidable band with a great lineup over the years, but they all got started here with their self-titled debut, my number 10 on the list. Next, at number 9, we have Spider's Lullabye by King Diamond, the 6th solo album by King Diamond, and he was a really busy guy in the 90s between new releases from Merciful Fate and his solo band, and Spider's Lullabye is one of the King's best offerings of the decade, in my opinion. His first release to feature bassist Herb Simonson and bassist Chris Estes and drummer Darren Anthony, and is also the band's first release on Metal Blade Records. Bit different from other King Diamond solo releases up to this point in the sense that it's not a full concept album, but rather only half the songs form a single plot, and so, in that sense, it's not as cohesive from beginning to end as some of his other work, but standalone tracks like, From the Other Side, Moonlight, Eastman's Curse, they're absolutely killer, right? It's great material, and by 1995, King Diamond hadn't made a solo album since The Eye from 1990, and so nearly a 5-year gap in between solo releases. So by the time of this record, the music scene had changed quite a bit, right? And in spite of the rise of grunge and alternative, the King still came through with a really underrated album. Number 8, Astro-Creep 2000 by White Zombie, the final studio album by White Zombie, and a much darker sounding record as well. The band also down-tuned the guitars and bass to give it the darker sound the songs required, and the lyrics took a darker turn compared to Devil Music Volume 1. And the album itself, much like White Zombie, is a little all over the place, right? And I think in a lot of respects, White Zombie were very much a product of their time, and yet it works. 30 years later, this album still feels fresh. It still feels unique here, combining groove and industrial with alternative metal. You have killer tracks like the classic More Human Than Human, right? Supercharger Heaven, Electric Head Part 2, I Zombie, and more. This is the only White Zombie studio album to feature John Tempesta on drums, and after this, Rob Zombie would go solo, soon after releasing Hellbilly Deluxe in 1998, and keeping a lot of similar vibes, to White Zombie in his solo career, but this is a tremendous final album by them here. Coming in at number 8, gonna go with Astro-Creep 2000. Number 7, I'm gonna go with Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness by the Smashing Pumpkins. Such an ambitious record at the time by the band, a 28-track double album here that features a vast variety of different styles, including, art rock, grunge, alternative pop, and metal. It's some of the band and Billy Corgan's best work to date, probably the best listened to in order, right? Instead of isolating tracks as the two, halves of the record are meant to represent day and night. But if I were to isolate some standout tracks here, right, some standouts would include 1979, Bullet with Butterfly Wings, Zero, and more. It's an alternative rock essential, and for my money, the Smashing Pumpkins' best work. Some might say Siamese Dream is, and, I wouldn't disagree with you. I think it's a close call, but, this album takes it for me personally. Just a great mix of ambition and experimentation, which is something that can often go south, but worked really well on Melancholy for sure. Ah yes, number 6, we have Ballbreaker by my beloved AC/DC, the follow-up to Razor's Edge from 1990, which was the band's big commercial return after, kind of an unceremonious, underwhelming end to the 80s, but they followed things up here in 95 with the return of Phil Rudd on Ballbreaker. Arguably their heaviest record, I think, and, a lot of that has to do with Rick Rubin producing the album, and it's a little wild to think that the guy who worked, was known for working with Slayer and Danzig, also collaborated with AC/DC. Standout tracks on this record for me include Hard as a Rock, Cover You in Oil, The Fuhrer, Burnin' Alive, Hail Caesar, Whiskey on the Rocks. The title track is phenomenal. It's got a great riff, and I love Boogeyman. Boogeyman is another, great standout track, another reason to love this album, because it marks the return of a more bluesy sound for AC/DC, which kind of died out with the Bon Scott era. But Boogeyman is very much in the same vein as Night Prowler, so I dig that quite a bit. Love the guitar solo on that track. Just a great record. And, and looking at their whole catalog, 30 years after its release, it's not an album that gets talked about nearly as much as it should, in my opinion. So, coming in at number 6, let's go with Ballbreaker by AC/DC. Breaking into the top 5 now with Outside by David Bowie. Bowie kickstarted his mid-90s creative resurgence with Outside, going for a more industrial-infused sound here, combining it with art rock and avant-garde, and working with producer Brian Eno for the first time again since, the Berlin trilogy in the 70s. So when Bowie wants to do something experimental, call in Brian Eno, right? And, it's a lengthy record. It clocks in at 74 minutes long, but the story told throughout is really cool. This was a very creative record told by Bowie, and he followed it up with Earthling in 1997, which is actually my introduction to David Bowie in his collaboration with Trent Reznor and I'm Afraid of Americans. Great stuff. But that continued his dive into industrial, and honestly, industrial Bowie is one of my favorite eras of his career. I think the material from Outside and Earthling have aged extremely well, and even people at the time were a little perplexed by it. I think a lot of fans have grown to appreciate, the way that Bowie reworked a lot of, deep cuts, that are deep in his catalog, for these tours, right? Bringing out songs like Andy Warhol, Joe the Lion, the Man Who Sold the World, and reworking them to, kind of work within the new sound he was pursuing here. I think that's really cool. I just think it's genius stuff from a guy who was never afraid to step out of his comfort zone and, take a step outside of the box and take on a new sound. And they called him the musical chameleon for a reason. He made it work. And this is another time that Bowie was able to reinvent himself here and do it, with flying colors, right? Just tremendous stuff, great understanding of the musicianship and the atmosphere of the music he was trying to create here, going for a more industrial sound, but a very cool concept as well. Really creative stuff and some great deep cuts that I'd love to see, have been given more attention recently with the Brilliant Adventure EP and things of that nature. I think that's been great to see because this era, like I said, is one of my personal favorites. So had to put it in the top 5. Coming in at number 5, let's go with Outside by David Bowie. Number 4, got to go with Above by Mad Season. One of my all-time favorite records here. It's an incredible grunge supergroup composed of Lane Staley of Alice in Chains, Mike McCready of Pearl Jam, John Baker Saunders, and Barrett Martin of Screaming Trees on the drums. And the hope when this album was being made was that being around newly sober musicians would help Lane Staley to stay clean, which unfortunately, as we know, did not happen. This was around the time Lane's voice was starting to change a bit. His voice wasn't as strong as it was, a few years earlier, and his vocals had become a bit more raspy. But I think this is some of the best work of Lane's entire career, maybe the peak of his lyricism as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of the material for this record came out of jam sessions the band were having, doing small gigs under the name The Gacy Bunch before they changed their name to Mad Season, where Lane would just come up with lyrics on the fly, doing that stuff live, specifically for River of Deceit and Wake Up. But, this album is a tremendous showcase also for Mike McCready, who really got to unleash on guitar and show his true prowess with Mad Season, similar to the creative freedom that he had with Temple of the Dog. He cut some of the best guitar solos of his entire career on this record. Definitely worth checking out is the live version of November Hotel from The More. Great live album, very indicative of just how much chemistry those guys had in, such a short period of time. And some standouts here for me include, like I mentioned, River of Deceit and Wake Up, also X-Ray Mind, I'm Above, Artificial Red, Lifeless Dead, I Don't Know Anything. It's got that great riff written by Lane as well, Long Gone Day, pretty experimental, almost jazzy track, which I really enjoy. I thought that was really cool, featuring Mark Lanigan. And so there are a lot of tracks on here that bring about, different vibes, atmospheres, different lyrical themes as well. And so I think it's a very diverse record, also very consistent, and like I said, some of Lane's best work. And so I really enjoy his songwriting on here. I think all four guys gelled really well together as a band. Great supergroup. I only wish they could have done more work together, but unfortunately it was not meant to be. We only have one album by Mad Season, and it's the classic Above, coming in at number 4 on the list. Top 3 now, let's go with Slaughter of the Soul by At the Gates, a landmark melodic death metal record by At the Gates. This album, alongside The Jester Race by In Flames and The Gallery by Dark Tranquillity, really helped to popularize the Gothenburg melodeath scene. And in fact, it'd be hard to imagine the Swedish death metal scene in general without those records, and Slaughter of the Soul, a huge part of that, right? This was the band's last album before their 11-year breakup from 1996 to 2007. And this album is just one great song after another from beginning to end, with some standouts for me being Blinded by Fear, the title track, Under a Serpent's Sun, World of Lies, and Cold, featuring an amazing collaboration with Merciful Fate guitarist Andy LaRocque, with an absolutely incredible guitar solo, just stellar stuff, regarded by many as, one of the best metal guitar solos of all time. And, it's one that guitarist Anders Bueller said that even he cannot play properly still to this day. My top 3, really my top 4, are really close together on this list, but this is a 10 out of 10 record. I had to put it in the top 3, had to put it close to the top, so getting a start in the top 3 here, we have Slaughter of the Soul by At the Gates. Coming in at number 2 here, we have Self-Titled by Alice in Chains, also known as Tripod, the band's last full-length studio album with vocalist Lane Staley, who, like I had mentioned before, a little bit about Lane's state at this point, was deep in the throes of heroin addiction, and, unfortunately things would only get worse over the next several years leading up to his death. And this album is, much darker than the other Alice in Chains records up to this point, and so much so that, it was a bit of a jarring listen when I first heard it. I was just getting into the band, having only heard Dirt and Facelift, and, when Tripod comes on, you definitely get caught a little off guard by how much Lane's voice had changed. They weren't as strong as they were on past albums, or even as strong as they were on with Mad Season, but, you can really feel the pain and emotion in his vocal delivery, and that makes it such a bleak album. I think producer Toby Wright does a fantastic job here of really capturing the band's current state, which I think can best be described as, it's 1 hour and 4 minutes of, just pure suffering by Alice in Chains, and Lane Staley really leaves it all out on this record. It's a very, like I said, bleak, doomy sounding album. Got some great riffs by Jerry Cantrell that are just filthy, and it's, the band's deepest and most introspective album to date, in addition to, being its heaviest. And some standouts for me include Grind, Brush Away, Sludge Factory, Heaven Beside You, even though I think it's a bit overplayed. Still a great song. Again, is fantastic. Head Creeps, Shame in You, So Close, God Am, Frogs, Over Now, Nothing Song is Fun. I mean, there are a lot of great songs on here. And like I said, it's a dark, depressing at times record, but very indicative of the mental state that the band were in at this point, and very indicative of the condition that Lane Staley was in at this time as well. So coming in at number 2 here, we have Self-Titled, Tripod by Alice in Chains. And finally, coming in at number 1, I have to go with Symbolic by Death. You could make the case that this is the best death metal album ever made, and I would not argue with you at all. Definitely the best death album in their catalog. Great lineup here with Chuck Schuldiner working alongside Bobby Coble, Kelly Conlon, and drummer Gene Hoglan. And Symbolic sees Death moving in a much more melodic direction compared to their previous albums. It's full of great riffs and brutal vocals by Chuck, but what makes this album for me, and what makes it so great, is the seamless blend of technical death metal with melodeath that the band had been, evolving towards since their debut. And that's one thing that's so great about Death's discography, is every album continued the band's evolution and Chuck Schuldiner's vision, which we know was unfortunately cut off way too soon with his passing in 2001. But these are timeless death metal classics for sure, and Symbolic is arguably their best record, and most consistent, definitely most refined as far as I'm concerned, with some great standouts on here like the title track, Zero Tolerance, Empty Words, 1,000 Eyes, Without Judgment, Crystal Mountain is phenomenal, Perennial Quest. So many great songs on here, a perfect death metal record from top to bottom, and my favorite from 1995. Rounding out our list here at number 1, gotta go with Symbolic by Death. So that wraps up this list here, taking a look at my top 20 favorite rock and metal albums turning 30 this year. Best albums from 1995. You guys can see my picks right over here. I'll leave honorable mentions down in the comments section. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel down below. Turn on the bell so you don't miss a new video. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue this series. I don't know what the interest level is. People, seeing me rank, favorite albums turning 20, favorite albums turning 10. I don't know. Maybe I've kind of beat this idea to death already. But if you guys are interested in that, let me know down below. Also, be sure to share your picks down below as well. What are some of your favorite rock and metal albums from 1995? I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.